Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Thanks to the Creative Mornings team. Thanks to the Center for Architecture and Design for hosting us. I always enjoy coming to these things. It's been a great way to meet people and be part of the community in Philadelphia. Since I'm a cartoonist by trade as well as a stay-at-home dad, I spend most of my time at home either doing domestic stuff or working at my computers. Having a thing where I can come out and actually meet people in person again, is always really nice. So I will introduce myself a little bit. There's a bit more info on the website too. I'm not going to get into all the stuff, but I'm a cartoonist. It's my vocation. I've been doing that since the late 80s. I started making photocopied fanzines, and from then went on to working on with publishing books with small independent publishers and larger publishers like Penguin. These are a few of my books from over the years. I've also been a teacher for a long time, along with my wife, Jessica Abel, who's here today and who's also spoke here back in 2019, and we're both regulars here. We taught at the School of Visual Arts in New York in the illustration and cartooning program for a long time. And out of that work, we ended up doing 2 textbooks on how to make comics. We were also the series editors of a really great series called The Best American Comics that ran for a few years, along with like The Best American Short Stories, The Best American Travel Writing, that whole famous series of books. Another thing that I do is I'm a translator, mostly from French, but also occasionally from Spanish, and mostly comic books. These are a couple of books that I've translated over the years. And I am the US correspondent of a French experimental comic group with an unusual sounding name, UBAPO, which in English is Workshop for Potential Comics. And I'll be coming back to that later because it's actually related to what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk to you today about the most important tool I've discovered as an artist. We're often led to believe that to be an artist means to have access to freedom and unbridled inspiration. But I've actually found that, although it seems paradoxical, putting obstacles and limitations on yourself, putting constraints in your way, can actually lead to even more innovation and creative solutions. So I want to explore that idea a little bit. So thinking inside the box, it's kind of one way of thinking about it. It's sort of a counter to what the sort of accepted idea is of like, go crazy, be wild. Sometimes going another direction can actually lead to wilder and crazier results. Let's take a look at a one-page comic by my friend François Ayol, who's a member of the aforementioned UBAPO. It's 8 panels telling the life story of a pop star. We see him in the first panel, in front of his fans. We see him in bed with a beautiful lady, proposing marriage to her. They're on their honeymoon. They're in the swimming pool. And then in the second to last panel, we see him tragically reaching to change a light bulb as he's about to get in the bathtub. And the last panel is his memorial statue on top of his grave. Now, if you look at this just visually for a minute, I'm sure you're seeing there's a bit of a pattern there. And what François has done here is he has structured this story around a very basic compositional constraint, where each panel has to have the same basic composition, which is the man figure standing with one arm up, John Travolta style. And so the trick to telling the story with this image is how do you change the context through changing the backgrounds and who he's interacting with to make that position show him dancing, lying in bed, throwing a beach ball, or whatever, okay? And it's also what gives the story its visual rhythm. And so the rhythm is not a term that I'm using a lot in this talk, but I think you'll see that it has very much to do with the kind of constraint that you get from having repetition and variation in a page. So the fact is, as strange as this story is, it's actually based on a true story. There was a pop singer named Claude François who was a big star in the 80s, and he actually electrocuted himself in his bathtub. You could tell that story in a number of ways, but by putting it into this very unique, repetitive constraint, he comes up with a really elegant and rhythmic and very funny storytelling through repetition, which is a big part of comedy as well. So constraints, of course, there are lots of different ways to talk about constraints and think about them. Constraints often have a negative connotation, right? They're stuff that hold us in and hold us back. And all forms of art are built around constraints. So whether you have the idea that you're working from a place of freedom and inspiration or not, you still have to deal with a page, right? You know, when you're starting on a blank, we talk about the blank page and the anxiety of the blank page, but it's blank and that there's nothing on it, but in fact it does have a shape to it, right? It's a rectangle. A screen is a rectangle. A canvas is a rectangle. Sheet music has the staves on there. There's always some kind of underlying structure that you're working against. So when I was teaching at School of Visual Arts, I used to do a drawing class, and I would have the kids, usually like undergrads, just do some sort of warm-up exercise. I'd say draw, take a piece of paper and draw, I don't know, 2 figures and a car or something like that. And I would walk around the classroom, and some of the kids could draw really well, and I could see that they had the anatomy was right, and the cars looked, not too wonky. But the drawings looked like hell because they were just kind of floating on this white space of the page. And I thought that was weird, and after a while I suggested, all right, we're gonna do the same exercise, but this time I want you to draw a rectangular frame on the page and then start filling that with your drawings. And I'd walk around the classroom, and the drawings now suddenly had interaction with each other. They were compositions. They were thinking about how these things interacted with that border. Maybe they were cropped off. Maybe they were grouped on one side or another. And it's ironic because, of course, all I'm doing is having them draw the frame of the piece of paper that they're actually already drawing on, right? But just the fact of being aware of that constraint leads them to interact with it and make it part of their creative process. So I'm a cartoonist, so if you take that same box and you divide it into smaller boxes, which you call panels in comics, then we have the armature of a comics page, right? So again, as a cartoonist, if I start working on a comic, just the fact of deciding I'm going to do 9 panels a page or 6 panels or some other kind of layout, that gives me something to work with, right? If we turn this rectangle sideways, it becomes very familiar since we're all prosumer photographers and videographers these days because of our phones. We're used to this kind of viewfinder idea, and all of the YouTube videos and TikTok tutorials that teach us about composition and how you use a grid to divide up space and decide how to distribute space, whether it's thinking about a landscape painting or framing characters on a sitcom, right? And these pre-existing constraints, the grid, the box of the picture plane, colors, and basic colors and black and white lines and shapes can of course also be the source of art themselves. And a lot of modernism was about taking those basic constraints to underlie any given medium, painting or fiction or whatever, and making that the subject of the art, all right? So if you take nothing else away from this talk, just think about the fact that like any constraint, any medium you work in has its own built-in rules, its parameters. And if you're unaware of them and claim to be completely free of them, you're actually not. You're a prisoner to these things you're not aware of. So becoming aware of the rules of your medium can give you a lot of power and material to work with, something to push against, which gives you a little bit of grist to make those pearls, right? Because there are multiple constraints to any given medium. So again, as a cartoonist, I have, before I even start working on a project, I'm aware of what I have to push against, which is things like the size and shape of the paper that I use, right? Most comics, at least until 15, 20 years ago, was all drawn on rectangular sheets of kind of cardstock paper called Bristol board, the vast majority of time, and drawn with a series of tools, dip pens and brushes, increasingly mechanical pens, and of course now tablets and digital writing. And even when you think about what a classic comic book, like a superhero, Wonder Woman, Superman kind of comic looks like, we think of that as an aesthetic style, right? But it actually comes largely out of the constraints of the printing technology of the time, right? Comics, until quite recently, were printed on very cheap newsprint. You couldn't really have a lot of detailed art. The colors couldn't be very rich. They also had to be cut by hand in little dot matrix stickers. So that led to a style of drawing that was very bold, and clean with not a lot of detail, not a lot of cross-hatching or stippling, and then these very flat colors in a very limited palette that was used underneath. At this point, that seems like, oh, this is like something you strive for. It's a creative decision you make. But it was just as much came out of the needs of the printing technology at the time. And again, up until the 70s or so, there were only comic books and newspapers if you were doing comics. Gradually, we started having trade paperbacks, the graphic novel format, comics on iPads. I even had a friend in Taipei who's a cartoonist, and he designs comics for little flip phones. Like they're tiny little, 2-inch square panels, and you flip through them. So that leads to a whole entirely different type of cartooning called for by the medium. And then there's the basic rules of how a reader perceives what you're doing. How they understand the drawings you're making, the path of flow in the case of comics, the way the eye usually moves through the page. And these are rules, of course, you can break, because comics is this sort of interesting mixture of time and space. You can use arrows to push people in a direction, you can confuse people, but there's a basic left to right, top to down, way of reading images and pictures that you need to understand and be able to implement in order for people to even understand what you're talking about. Finally, constraints of time, right? Deadlines are onerous, but they're also can be very useful. A lot of us know we can't actually finish projects until we actually have that deadline. So it's something that's, whether self-imposed or imposed by an art director or a publisher, it's something that can call us on our BS and make us just like commit to finishing a work. And you're never satisfied entirely with what you're done, but having a deadline, producing something, putting it out in the world is very satisfying. And it can get you to finish stuff that you wouldn't have otherwise have done. And for example, again, speaking of rhythm, I'm trying to keep this moving so that I'm keeping a look at my deadline here to stick to my constraint of trying to keep this talk in 20 minutes or so. But as we saw in Francois's comic, I'm talking about a slightly different idea here of a constraint. I'm talking about, we can call it a creative constraint. So in addition to all these pre-existing constraints, what I like to do is add an extra constraint on there. So what is an example of a creative constraint besides what we've already seen? For example, if you have a comic you're going to do, it's going to be 9 panels. Maybe you decide, instead of drawing people or action scenes or anything else, you're only going to have square panels that'll be black and white or half and half. And then the challenge becomes like, well, how do I make a comic out of that? What kind of story can I tell? This is just one page from a 24-page comic by French cartoonist Louis Trondheim. And he ended up telling this sort of epic story about climate change, where he's talking about the Antarctic and the Arctic Circle and nighttime and things melting and things catching on fire through these bold geometric shapes. Okay? I'll give you an example from my work of how both of these constraints can interplay to create new work. So in 2012, I was commissioned to do an illustration for a magazine from Colgate University, Scene magazine. And because they were doing an article about the history of American comic books. So the art directors contacted me. They gave me a deadline, deadline for sketches, deadline for final art. So that was useful, a little bit stressful, but I knew I had to do that. They also gave me a format. They said it's going to be more than a half page, pretty big illustration space. So that was, I have a sense of the space there, but that's a big white empty expanse there to fill. So my first thought was like, I'm not sure what to do. And to their credit, the art directors actually said, well, since it's a comic, an article about comic books, we were thinking maybe you could do a comic as an illustration. And I thought, aha, now I've already taken that big rectangle and I can break it down into smaller rectangles, and it starts to give me stuff to wrestle with. So I thought 6 panels just randomly seemed like a good way to just sort of touch on the history of comics. And it was at that point I was thinking about how to handle this thing, and I remembered our comic from François Hérault that we already watched, where he used that repeating composition. I thought, oh, maybe I can steal that idea and apply it to American comic books. Because again, this is not newspaper comics. It's really like from Superman up until like the graphic novel is sort of how I took the assignment. So I came up with like a very simple composition of a superhero type of character with an emblem on his shirt, some dialogue, and some background. and just copied and pasted. And then I just thought about like, how can I tell a sort of story that goes chronologically and illustrates some of the development with a bit of irony and humor of comics from the earliest appearance of Superman in Action Comics #1 in the late 20s to the modern era of the kind of postmodern graphic novel exemplified by artists like Chris Ware. And so this is the final result. And I was able to play with especially the emblems going from the star to an exclamation point, which is like a parody from Mad Magazine, the psychedelic spiral, the $sign, at all these levels, play with something that really does show a certain sense of the history of the medium with a bit of commentary in there as well. And it was really that constraint of using that repetition that gave me the material to play with to finish this comic, which ended up being my sort of most reshared. Back in the days of Tumblr, it was my most shared page on that site. So one thing about these constraints, these creative constraints, is that they're often arbitrary. They're something you just kind of pull out of thin air almost, that's something that's going to really kind of throw you off balance. And that's where the creative challenge comes in. Just for a couple of quick examples, Donald Barthelme has a short story called Concerning the Bodyguard. It's in his collection, 40 Stories. And the entire story, every sentence is a question. Well, he cheats 3 or 4 times. There are a couple of sentences. But the challenge then is, how do you tell a story? How do you move something forward when every single question, every single line of the story is asking you a question, pushing back at you, the reader, right? Lars von Trier, the Danish filmmaker, made a really fascinating project on this whole subject, which I highly recommend, called The 5 Obstructions, with a fellow filmmaker and mentor, Jürgen Leth, who'd made a famous short film called The Perfect Human in 1968. And so Lars von Trier challenges Jürgen Leth to remake this movie 5 times. It's a short film. And each time he's going to give him a list of completely arbitrary rules to follow. And so the documentary is about this whole kind of like one-upsmanship, almost like a chess game between 2 artists. So for example, he challenges them to go film it on location in Cuba, in Havana, with a local cast that he would select there. Then he ends up going to Bombay for a totally different reason, films it in front of a scrim, and the filmmaker himself, Jürgen Leth, plays the character of the main role, the perfect human. There's an animated version that they film in Austin, Texas, with that studio that did Richard Linklater's Scanner Darkly and this kind of motion capture kind of stuff. So these are like really out of left field constraints, and each time the challenge for the artist is, how do you take that and turn it into gold, into something really compelling? And Jürgen Leth in that movie, at one point, he thinks he's been defeated by his constraints. Then he looks back later, he's like, it was a paper tiger. It was a paper tiger. You get that moment, it's very satisfying when you figure out how to work around the solution. So let me back up quickly and show you how I came to this world of constraints. And it comes from an author named Raymond Queneau, who's a French writer. And in the mid-1940s, he went to see a concert of Johann Sebastian Bach doing The Art of the Fugue, which is a piece of music based on a very short melodic idea that he does variations on. So he takes that little melody, dun, 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 just that little piece, and he stretches it out slow, he flips it upside down, he puts it backwards in the score, and develops a whole series of variations on a theme through that. And so after that concert, Queneau and his friend were talking and said it would be cool to take that idea and apply it to literature. And he wrote a book called Exercise in Style. There's a series of short texts where he tells the same story, sort of anecdote from different points of view, told as in the form of a haiku or a sonnet, told in advertising language, told in nonsense, told in telling the story backwards, inserting the colors of the rainbow, all kinds of stuff. I'll give you a quick analog from another work called Variations on a Theme by Shakespeare, which was inspired by Queneau, and you'll see where it comes from quickly. The first one, minimal variations. To see or not to see. To flee or not to flee. To pee or not to pee, right? Or antonyms, nothing and something. This was an answer. amplification. To live forever or never to have been born is a concern that has perplexed humanity from time immemorial and still does. One more, in another meter. So should I be or should I not? This question keeps me on the trot. Right? So I ran with this idea, and I had the same reaction that Queneau had to Bach when I discovered Queneau's book. I thought that would be a cool idea to adapt to comics, because comics has, of course, a lot of the same rhetorical devices and storytelling strategies as prose. And of course, we have text, we have narration, dialogue, but we also have drawing in different styles, drawing in different genres, realistic drawing and cartoony drawing. And we have the graphic design element, which I think is very important to comics, the panels on the page and how they interact with each other. So I came up with a very simple anecdote, for better or worse, sort of based on my own life. It's hard to write a non-story. That was actually the hardest part of getting started on this project. A man's at a computer, he gets up, goes to the next room, somebody asks him what time it is, he answers, opens a refrigerator door, and then realizes he's forgotten what he was looking for. So it's sort of an everyday, barely qualifies as the anecdote. But what it does is it gives me 8 panels, a couple of characters, some dialogue, some stuff to work with. And so what I started doing, and following Queneau's model, he wrote 99 variations. I thought about different ways to tell the story, from the character's point of view, from the refrigerator's point of view, right, which pushes. And again, you see here how, like, when you take a constraint or a rule like this, it can be fun and also productive to push it to a logical and sometimes absurd extreme, just for fun, right? Like another version of that, going through the colors of the rainbow. A favorite of mine is just increasing the protagonist by 1 in each panel. Until the last panel, there's 8 figures surrounding the refrigerator not knowing what they're looking for, right? So there's homages / parodies of famous comic book styles and artists, a manga version, and I even pushed the limits of what we normally think of as comics. So in what ways, for example, is a map like a comic? It is a kind of visual storytelling where we use image and text to tell ourselves a story and hopefully not get lost in the desert of what the hell was I looking for anyway. So this book came out in 2005 and has had a bunch of foreign editions and continues to get reprinted. And it's been really, it's been a work that has galvanized me creatively and professionally. It's really what has sort of put me on the map and gave me the confidence, like, I feel like I know what I'm doing now. It was the first time I had that sense. And it was because of this, the repetition and variation and coming up with these rules each time to challenge myself. I never felt like I was going to run. I had to stop at 99 for fear of just continuing, because I could keep on going with this forever. And as I was working on the book, I was reading more about Raymond Queneau and reading his novels, which I highly recommend. They're wonderful. He's best known for Zazie and the Metro, which Louis Malle made a film out of in the early 60s. I learned that he had started a group called Oulipo, which sounds familiar to you, but it's a little bit different. This one is Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, which is the workshop for potential literature. And it's kind of a drinking club that meets every month in Paris since 1960 to talk about literature and how you can use rules and constraints and ideas, even borrowed from math and logic, to not in the name of turning literature into a math problem, but actually to find weird inspiration in these very difficult rules and how you can apply them to create poems and novels. A famous quote of Queneau's to describe the project of the group is rats who propose to build the maze from which they plan to escape. Right? So again, it's like really painting yourself in the corner for the fun of it, for the perverse pleasure of that. The most famous example from literature from Oulipo is the French author Georges Perec, who wrote a book called La Disparition, which was not so much translated as adapted in an English version called Avoid. And we'll see if oh yeah, it works, all right, good. La Disparition is a type of constraint called a lipogram, which is a text that you write without using one or more letters of the alphabet. Sounds very postmodern and something that Georges Perec would have invented. It actually has existed since ancient Greece. He found texts from ancient Greece, from medieval Spain, from all over the world in all literatures where people have written texts for one reason or another. Like, why would you even come up with this idea? It's really crazy to me, but like writing a text without a certain letter. So La Disparition, as you might guess, is written without the letter E, which, like English, but even more so, in French is almost impossible to do because E is by far the most used letter, and it's associated with all feminine endings and adjectives. And yet there are female characters in the book somehow, which I don't even remember how he works it out. It's actually a very legible, readable, fun book, almost like an Agatha Christie mystery. Famously, when the book came out, one review failed to notice that the E's weren't in there. Like, oh, Perec's new novel is pretty good. It's sort of a mystery, So it's a bit of an act of showmanship to put. It's like 350 pages without an E, except one that he snuck in just to show that he could do it. The mystery is about characters who slowly become aware that something's missing from their life, and maybe it's sort of a circular shape with a bar in the middle and a circle. And as soon as they realize it's the E, they die a horrible death, and that's sort of like the drama of the show. So it has an element of comedy and just like playful experimental fabulism like you had in the 1970s. But Perec was born George Peretz in Poland. He was Jewish, and his family sent him to France in World War II. His mother died in a concentration camp. His father died fighting the Nazis. And one reading of this book, because he wrote a lot about the Holocaust throughout his career, is that missing E, which is something that's so common you can't live without, is some kind of commentary in a sort of roundabout way to talk about the Holocaust, about losing your parents, because in French, mère and père both have two E's. And of course, Georges Perec, he's got 4 E's in his own name, so it's a kind of self-negation that he's talking about through this book. So these are formal games, but also ways to really talk about very, very deep and emotional stuff. Around the same time I discovered all of this work, a bunch of French cartoonists were also exploring some of these ideas, and they started a officially anointed offshoot of the Oulipo group called UBAPO, because Bande Dessinée is the French for comics, so the workshop for potential comics. And so they do stuff like comics that are acrostics. We already saw Francoise using the repeated composition. This is a comic you can read in any direction. They also do kind of détournement and sort of mashups and remixes of other works. So here's a Tintin in America that Jochen Gerner took a black ink out and literally blacked out the cover to make a whole new book. He did this with a whole book called TNT in America. So here's a page from the book, and he literally is blacking it out. So this color that you're seeing is just what's left of the original art, is just these abstract fields of color. So I'm speeding up a little bit because I'm trying to keep on the time here, but once you start this, some of you might already like, oh yeah, I read Cano and I already know about this stuff. Some of you, this might be the first time you're doing like, oh yeah, that's true, you can put rules and stuff. I can guarantee now that we're talking about this, you're going to start seeing these constraints everywhere in all media. So just a couple of quick examples. Lin-Manuel Miranda, you don't really think of him as an avant-garde practitioner, but he did a song called Almost Like Praying that was a benefit for Puerto Rico after the hurricane in 2017, which was Hurricane Maria. And he was trying to think how to very quickly and very creatively write a pop song that would sell a lot and actually get money for relief. And he was thinking about Maria being the name of the hurricane and also the most common Spanish name and a very important name in Puerto Rico. And of course, it made him think of being a musical geek. He thought of West Side Story. And the song for Maria with the refrain, say it soft and it's almost like praying. And because he's Lin-Manuel Miranda, he was able to get permission from Sondheim and Bernstein estates to use that sample of a loop saying it's almost like praying, say it soft and it's almost like praying, and build a musical bed off of that. So, because a lot, hip hop and a lot of modern music production is based on, again, here's the rhythm idea. It's like taking a piece of pre-recorded sample, drum tracks, vocals, whatever, and looping them and building more stuff on top of that. So, and by the way, this all comes from a podcast called Song Exploder, which is a really good podcast where musicians talk about how they wrote their songs. So he goes into detail on all this and explains the Maria part. And also he talks about the lyrics, which the lyrics of the song, he decided he wanted to make it a celebration of Puerto Rico. And he decided to make the lyrics just the names of all of the municipalities in Puerto Rico, of which there are 78, I think. And so the challenge then became how to put them in order. He didn't just want to do it alphabetically, so he started looking for ways to group them together by constraints, almost like exercise in style. So it would be words that had that began with san or santa, words that rhymed, words that had some kind of internal rhyme, like aguadilla, quebradilla, guayanilla, guanadillas, words that had, so that's how he grouped these all together. And then he, of course, got famous Puerto Rican pop stars to come in and sing and rap over it all. And another thing he points out in the interview was really interesting is that the name Maria never actually appears in the song. So whether consciously or not, he's hearkening back to the idea of the lipogram of evoking something really powerful and terrible at the same time by not explicitly not mentioning it, right? You think of Hurricane Maria, you think of Maria from West Side Story, you think of all the people you know named Maria from Puerto Rico, but the name actually never appears in the song. I thought that was a really powerful moment. This is a little sample from the Declaration of Independence. It actually is much longer than I realized. There's a whole long thing where they just list grievances against the king. It's just like, you know, it's like a Lin-Manuel Miranda rap out of Hamilton, actually. So the poet Tracy K. Smith, who was the poet laureate a few years ago, she went through this text and did a sort of a blackout poem kind of thing, kind of like what Guerna did with the Tintin thing. Removed text and selectively edited some of the text here we see in red, and wrote a short poem called Declaration, where she seems to be finding this sort of like subliminal cries of protest of African Americans sort of buried in the language of the Declaration of Independence, which actually excluded them. So it's again a way of riffing playfully on a historical text to create a kind of social commentary. So this stuff is everywhere. So why should you use constraints in your own work? First of all, we've talked about the fear of the blank page, setting yourself some kind of constraint, some kind of rule, even if it's as simple as drawing that little rectangle when you're starting a drawing, or thinking about setting the margins on your Word document, is a great way to start giving you something to push against, to get started on a project. It's a prompt, it gives you something to react to. So, and it might be something that just gets you started, right? When they do things like creative writing classes and NaNoWriMo and project, there's often a prompt like this, or like a theme we have at Creative Mornings, like rhythm is the theme. It's something you can use as a starting point and take it or leave it. And that's fine. The point is to get started and get excited about your work. But it can also be something that you dig into and becomes something you come back to more and more for inspiration. I had a student a few years ago in a workshop named Lisa Frubeis in Germany, and she had been assigned given a summer weekend comic slot in like a major German paper, like on the Sunday paper in the magazine. And she didn't know what to do. She was kind of freaked out about it. She hadn't really done a lot of comics at that point. And in this workshop we were doing, I had them do haiku comics as a kind of warm-up exercise and talk about like how can you, I'm really interested in borrowing forms from other media and mixing them together. So we talked about how a haiku would work in comics. So if you look at this page, you'll see the page layouts mimic the 5-7-5 syllable structure of a haiku. The text in her comic is also a haiku. And this gave her a starting point that she really latched onto, because then she was like, okay, well, if I'm going to do a comics haiku, I also the art needs to be simple and sparse, like the language of a haiku. So she'd been drawing much more cartoony, detailed work. She really stripped down her style and started using making color choices too. Each one had a very simple color schema. And then she's like, that's not enough. I need more rules for myself. So she said, I'm doing this as a weekly newspaper, so every page has to have a reference to the week's news. So in this one, in the middle, there's some kind of Nobel jury 2017 kerfuffle, which we've all forgotten about. And she mentioned her breakfast that she'd had that morning. And did a whole series, which was quite successful, and it really, I could see that it was pushing her to a next level as an artist and opening all kinds of horizons. And while I won't take all credit for her future success, she's gone on to do a bunch of books and done projects like she designed a art for a tram system in Augsburg, Germany, for the Jewish feminists, Women's Month there. So, some of this stuff is a little bit like avant-garde and hoity-toity sounding, but it's also about play. These constraints are about treating the creative act as a kind of play. And what constraints do, in addition to everything else, is that they push you into that place that we call deep play, where you get deeply lost in the work, completely absorbed, time disappears, you're not really thinking about whether it's good enough or whether you have talent or not. You're just focused on solving this fiendishly perverse problem that you've posed for yourself, right? So my invitation to you is to make a constrained piece of your own. For example, you could write a bio. We often write like bios all the time for different events like this and stuff, even if they don't make it to the final slideshow or not. And so try writing one without using your initials, whatever the letters of your initials are, or maybe all the letters of your name. Can you write a bio of your life without using your initials? Or maybe only using the letters that are in your name, okay? Give that a try. It sounds crazy, but I bet you'll come up with an interesting result. And you can share it with me later on. I would love to see it, or put it on Instagram or something. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I actually made it through just a few minutes over, I think, here. So we have maybe some time for questions. Yeah, thanks for coming out.